All right, so endocrine system. So for endocrine system itself, this is one of our systems where we are really getting into the idea of coordination and control. So remember that we've got a couple different systems that tend to do this. Certainly the nervous system that we learned about at the end of 201, and now in endocrine system. So whereas the nervous system is more like a wired system, the endocrine system is a wireless system. They both use chemical messengers that are going to arrive at a target cell, bind with particular receptors that is then going to initiate some sort of action at the target cell. Now, in the nervous system, that chemical messenger is a neurotransmitter, and it's released across a very small gap that we call the synaptic cleft. Meanwhile, in the endocrine system, we're talking about a hormone that gets released into the blood, travels long distances, and still then arrives at the target cell or organ, binds with particular receptors, and then elicits an effect at that particular organ. So those receptors is what makes this system of messaging, if you will, specific. So it can pass by, the hormone can pass by all kinds of other cells as it winds its way around the cardiovascular system, but will only have an effect on those cells that have the appropriate receptors, right? The whole lock and key mechanism. Now for endocrine system, this tends to be something that is usually a little bit longer in duration compared to nervous system, right? Nervous system, we can elicit a small twitch that then is over in a fraction of the time. Whereas endocrine system, we're casting these out into the blood, and so it takes a while for it to get out there. It takes a while for it to go away. Imagine the adrenaline rush that you get if you're driving like I was on the way to work today, and we're going around a roundabout, and somebody forgets that there's 2 lanes in the roundabout, and they just start widely going into your lane. So then that kind of rush of adrenaline stays with you for a period of time because it's floating around in your system. Okay, so we have that kind of as an introduction there. So when we look at some of the things that the endocrine system is controlling, again, we see it as more of a long-term type of response on the order of minutes, hours, days, even, periods of your life as well. So we do a little bit of introduction and reminder about the difference between exocrine glands and endocrine glands, especially since we were coming off the digestive system where we had a lot of secretions coming from exocrine glands there. And we start talking about how the endocrine system does its job in terms of controlling and coordinating cells around the body. And those can be target cells, again, that are very far away. They can be cells and organs in a totally different system, or it can be cells and organs that are within the endocrine system. So a tiered type of approach where we have, if you will, a manager, and then an assistant manager, and then a shift manager, and then a worker. And so anything that happens in any of those levels above trickles down and has an effect down below as well. Sometimes you have endocrine glands signaling other endocrine glands and telling them what to do. Okay, so as we get into it, we do talk some about how the receptors, because that's the, if you will, listening part of this message, how they are maintained and how the cells can increase their hearing or decrease their hearing in terms of being receptive to hormones. So it's a smaller topic in terms of upregulation and downregulation, but it's not static. Like we said, we can listen carefully, chemically, or we can kind of tune these messages out. Another small topic that we get at the beginning of this chapter has to do with other types of circulating or local hormones that are not necessarily going to distant target cells, but are going more to nearby cells. So remember when we were talking about the digestive system, we said that there were, for instance, there was a hormone known as gastrin that actually stimulates other cells within the stomach. And so that gives us the idea of these things that we call paracrines, where we have a nearby cell that is releasing hormones that is then having an effect within that same organ. There are even cells that can self-stimulate as well. Okay, so that's a minor topic though. Major topic, first major topic, if you will, in this system has to do with our hormones themselves. What are they made from? How are they synthesized? How do they transport in the blood? How do they have this effect on their target cells? And so there are two major chemical classes of hormones based on their solubility. One group is called lipid soluble, and the other group, are called, it was there, you saw it, water soluble. Okay, so you definitely need to know the difference between these. So in terms of, like we said, those comparisons, what they're made from, where they're synthesized in the cell, how they're transported in the blood, where they have their receptors on the target cells, etc. So you could even make up, kind of simple flashcards for those. This chapter really does kind of align itself very well with making flashcards. We'll find later on when you're learning about specific hormones, putting the name of the hormone on the front and then putting where it comes from, what specific organ and region of the organ it comes from, and its particular effects at a target cell. It helps to break down all this information into little chunks that you can study one at a time. Okay, so knowing about the lipid-soluble hormones, that they come from basically a cholesterol molecule, so we'll talk a little bit about that. Water-soluble hormones are more kind of protein-based or amino acid-based, things like that. And then, like we said, we get into this idea of how they're transported in the blood because it's different. Lipid-soluble hormones need to transport protein, as you can see along the left side there. Meanwhile, water-soluble hormones are going to be able to float in the water contained within the plasma with no problem. But when we get to the target cell, lipid-soluble hormones can go right through that plasma membrane, and they bind with a receptor that is inside of the nucleus. And then, basically, that ends up stimulating the cell to produce proteins of its own or whatever as it alters gene expression, so that as we turn on a gene and a certain protein is going to be made, it could be a new hormone, could be receptors, could be something like that. So we want to know those types of comparisons. On the other side of the coin, water-soluble hormones, again, talking about how they travel, where the receptor is located. Here on the surface of the cell is where we find the receptors for proteins. They can't get through that lipid bilayer, so they rely on a messenger system that relays through a series of chemical steps. It relays a signal inside of the cell. So not only does that get the signal from the outside of the cell to inside of the cell, but in addition, what we find is we have the possibility, of what we call amplification, where when we look at these different steps that we're seeing right here, we can see that there is amplification where you can have one molecule going up to 100, going up to 10,000, etc. Kind of a pyramid type of effect, but in a good way for the body. So you should know about amplification as well. Now we've been talking about, much like a nervous system where we're like, okay, this neuron can talk to that neuron, and looking at it in a very simple way, we know that's more complex than that, neural networks, etc., collaborative effects, if you will. Same thing happens in the endocrine system too. A target cell has lots of different receptors on it, and it can be influenced or controlled by a number of different hormones, and sometimes those hormones will have interactions. So again, a small topic is knowing the name or being able to define when these hormones interact on a cell and give an example. So the three different types of interactions are called the permissive, synergistic, and antagonistic effects. So again, not a ton of time spent on that, but you should know the difference between those three. Another major topic is knowing, okay, how does an endocrine gland know when it's time to release a hormone? Well, it can be stimulated by the nervous system. It can be stimulated by another hormone from a different gland, or it can have receptors associated with it that are testing the fluid or humor for the concentration of a particular molecular ion, like calcium ions or sodium or more so glucose, etc. So knowing control of hormonal secretion as well. Each time we get to a system, we usually are talking about, okay, how does the system work, but then how is it controlled and coordinated? And in this case, we see our normal types of control, right? Nervous system, endocrine system, and then there's usually some sort of internal system where they're kind of monitoring things themselves. Okay, the bulk of the chapter really is this tour through the variety of different endocrine glands, talking about the different regions of them. If they have regions like a medulla and a cortex, or an anterior and a posterior, etc. If there are different groupings or islands of cells, then those different cells are going to put out different hormones. So again, really lends well to flashcards. So hormone on the front, and then all the information about it on the back. You can even group them, color code them. These are the ones from the pituitary gland. These are the ones from the adrenal gland. You'll find that those two glands are the most complex. They put out the most number of hormones. There are certain endocrine glands that put out like one hormone. That's a nice thing, but these ones are certainly more complex. So in terms of spending your time, adrenal gland, pituitary gland, critical. Okay, so again, talking about the pituitary gland, how there's two parts of it, an anterior part, a front part, and a back part. And you need to know the hormones from each. Plus, you need to know how, in fact, the hypothalamus that we see up here, right, is in control of both of these halves, the anterior half and the posterior half. But it controls it in two different ways. It has a unique relationship with both ways. You definitely should know that in terms of short answer questions, in terms of more multiple choice questions. Again, we said pituitary gland is a big one because it puts out a bunch of different hormones, and this relationship between the hypophysis, which is the pituitary gland, and the hypothalamus that we see up above is a critical one. Okay, so again, the bulk of the chapter is, okay, what's a hormone that comes from this organ and what does it do? Now, many of them have simple functions. For those that are more complex, like growth hormone and epinephrine, etc., if you know 2 or 3 functions to be able to list, that's fine. Okay, so talking about flashcard material, etc. The only other thing that we find as well is that in some cases, again, we will see some kind of synergistic effects where the hormones have similar types of responses. So like, for instance, growth hormone, epinephrine, cortisol, all work to increase metabolism and cellular activity, etc. So realizing when we have examples of, again, synergy or antagonistic effects is going to be important. So the rest of this is just the tour, right? So you'll go through and you'll be introduced to different organs like you were in lab, and then we're learning the hormones that they put out and what those hormones do. Now when we get to the gonads, we're going to spend more time with that when we get to reproductive system. So much like when we were doing blood and then immune system, we'll introduce it a little bit here in terms of those sex hormones, but then we'll get into the detail of them when we get to reproductive system next. Okay? All right, so that should be what you should know in terms of our endocrine system, the focal points, etc. So I hope that helps.